I'm going to be talking about three things in this speech. Firstly, how we feel better about ourselves. Secondly, how this has helped improve the social standing of particular groups. And then thirdly, on societal benefits. On to how we feel better about ourselves, because I think that this motion quite intuitively is going to be like people feel like shit when they are not productive. But I actually think that for the vast majority of people who are coerced into capitalist systems under either side of a house, this is uniquely a powerful vehicle in allowing people to access a sense of happiness and a sense of identity. There are a couple layers in this claim. Firstly, the notion of being productive and joy that comes from that allows people to access a sense of identity that is far more accessible relative to other ways that people try and feel good and happy about themselves. I think that all individuals, as beings who just want to feel happy and validated, continually look for something in their life that is going to bring them a sense of fulfillment. But I think that other measures are quite inaccessible. Firstly, money is very inaccessible because for structural reasons, a lot of people are poor, and no matter how hard they work due to societal discrimination, have a difficult time attaining that. Secondly, they often look for forms of like social validation, but that's often difficult if you are just someone who's not super popular, if you're someone who's not conventionally attractive. I think that thirdly, we often look to things like valuing the end goal of what we do. So if we are able to produce something and that thing is very cool, we value that. But the problem is, for a variety of reasons, people are often not able to attain tangible resources that they often value. I think that this, comparatively speaking, is a very, very accessible goalpost that the vast majority of people are able to access. This is for a few reasons. Firstly, there is no clear metric that defines what productivity actually looks like. In the event that productivity manifests in like your employer telling you to do X, Y, and Z thing, that is uncomparative. But productivity culture is very much about what we individually define as being productive and the kind of goals that we want to set, because there is just like no God who tells us what productivity ultimately is. So it's often based on our personal experiences, taking smaller steps forward every single day. How can I improve from the point where I'm presently at, and which spheres of my life do I want to be productive? So it's quite a malleable narrative. Secondly, it's very focused on the process rather than just the end goal. So even if I happen to not be the most intelligent person in the world, if I'm making steps on a project that I'm currently working on, I'm still able to access that sense of fulfillment. I think that thirdly, this is something that's expansive outside of the realm of capitalism. So the cult of productivity is not just exclusive to like economics, but it's also about things like productivity in our personal life. So I can feel productive if I take some time to journal or write in my diary every night because I'm still fulfilling that particular kind of goal. So we just allow more people to access a level of identity that I think is very valuable to people. Does CEO have a POI now?
It seems unlikely this isn't tied up in other norms. We say, for instance, that doctors are more productive than artists, so you can't assert that everyone is going to feel equally productive.
I mean, I think that artists, if they just produce the painting that they're working toward, can absolutely feel that way. I'm also going to clash with the next characterization about how this helps access a sense of fulfillment within a capital system uniquely. I just want to characterize here that productivity is not like the cause of capitalism, but rather it's a symptom of capitalism that exists. Why do I think that capitalist norms that are going to force people to work hard are probably going to exist under either side of a house? Firstly, the education system is just objectively a grueling one where you're like forced to get shit done, to submit your assignments, to get high grades. Secondly, the job market is just one that's quite oversaturated. People need employment, and therefore there's an incentive to push yourself really hard to like put food on the table for your own family. And thirdly, the bourgeoisie capitalist elite have a massive incentive to create norms to push people to maximize their productivity in order to just get like their own companies doing better and their share prices going up. Within this world then, given that there are going to be the pressures for the working class to work very, very hard under either side of the house, this narrative then uniquely allows people to feel much better about themselves because you're able to access a personal level of joy. So every single day, if I go to work and like I'm working my ass off for 8 hours, this no longer just feels like menial labor, but given that it is tied to some kind of morality, I'm able to feel good about myself, like I'm a virtuous being. And I think this is good, which applies to so many people who are often doing the most kinds of work. The conflicting op frame is obviously all. What about like people who have like mental illnesses or for a variety of reasons cannot work hard? A few responses to that. Firstly, this narrative is not incompatible with other social narratives that emphasize other ends. There's a narrative right now that mental health matters with the rise of things like Let's Talk campaigns, the entire self-care industry, even just the entire corporate industry that is selling things like vacations, which pushes us to want to maximize leisure in other ways. Therefore, for people who need an out from this narrative, there are other narratives that they're able to turn to. Secondly, saying that productivity is good is not incompatible with saying that mental health matters and that there are certain people, for reasons beyond their control, struggle to conform to that. Thirdly, we've uniquely been able to push for things like mental health resources on the basis of improving productivity. So, i.e., like getting more medication for kids in school who have ADHD. People who are not persuaded by other narratives often are persuaded by you need mental health help because it's ultimately good for individual and social productivity at the end of the day. Before I get into our second argument, CEO again.
If this is supposed to motivate people, it cannot be easy to achieve because then it would fail to push people to work harder once they achieve it.
Yeah. So I'm going to get to our nuanced frame in like the next arguments, but basically I think that for like the majority of working class people, the main narrative, the main delta in the round is just how people feel about themselves. And like higher class people work harder, and I'll explain the benefits of that. So for certain groups, this narrative has uniquely allowed people to access a sense of social standing when they were previously excluded from that. I think it's mostly about self-perception, but it's also about how you perceive other people within society who tend to be working harder. And in a world where we tie that to like virtue, this changes how we end up perceiving other people. I think there are two groups of people who have benefited the most from productivity being seen as virtuous. Firstly, like menial workers in the context of capitalism, those who are like working at McDonald's, and then secondly, immigrants who are often associated with notions of working very hard. Within this world, we increasingly celebrate these people because we place valuation on the notion of working hard as an inherent trait rather than just the end goals of what productivity ultimately brings. This narrative is very important in humanizing these people for a couple of reasons. Firstly, other facets of society tend to be incredibly degrading. There tends to just be a lot of like racism, who are disproportionately lower level workers tend to just disproportionately be people of color. Capitalism quite literally has an incentive to demonize the value of the proletariat labor, given that that can just justify things like worker abuses and paying people extremely low prices. And secondly, human rights-based discourse is often unpersuasive because saying that people inherently deserve things is still contingent on people buying into the fact that they're deserving to being granted those rights in the first place. What this means then is that in order for rights-based discourse to actually be effective, we need people within society actually valuing what hard work is as some kind of inherent kind of moral goal, meaning that this narrative has uniquely allowed things to push for like basic kinds of worker benefits, like pension plans, increased pay for workers and minimum wage. For those kind of policies are really important. Increased integration programs and protections for immigrants, and have helped people who are the most harmed by capitalism access a better quality of life. Finally, on the social benefits of productivity, as I flagged the POI response, the majority of people within capitalist structures who are like working class, this motion is not really going to impact them. What it does impact though are like more privileged people who do have the capacity to work harder if they wanted to opt into that goal, and they might be more likely to do that in order to access a feeling of internal and external virtue. I think the reason this is good is that there's often a trickle-down social benefit of this. So for people who are working in like the charity sector, if they have time to like do that, or like healthcare researchers, when they're not necessarily going to be making more like money, they're more likely to actually invest in that discipline, which is actually beneficial for forms of societal innovation. For all of these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to stand in OG.
We thank the first speaker or Prime Minister of Opening Government. We call the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. Panel, the full symmetry in opening government's case is they say that just because we're in capitalism, there's no delta. But just because you're embedded in capitalism doesn't mean that there's no work-life balance. Doesn't mean that your additional self-worth has to be detached from the unit of your labor. That is the comparative that Naomi failed to defend. What is symmetrical in this debate is this. A, you'll still be able to derive self-value from your work. Additionally, people on our side still work, people still care about their work. What is the unique delta here is that people no longer see that as a primary source of their self-value, and it gives more people the ability for us to opt out of this narrative. Second, people still have an incentive to do the things they like to do. Like people still have altruistic drives. I question the answer that people go for charity because of this so-called code that makes people work extra longer hours. I think there's a very marginal change here. And there's still profit incentives for corporations to provide those fundings that Naomi talked about. They don't provide it because society values, for example, the very notion of work. It is because there are profit incentives why people want to provide a minimum wage. It gives you healthier workers. It helps you to land better workers. It gives you more stability. It gives you a higher profit margin as a corporation. Before getting to substance, a quick framing upon what the norm looks like. Firstly, it blurs lines about your identity. It tells us that your self-worth and other forms of identity is essentially going to be boiling down to a productive unit. Second, it's likely going to be controlled by other sources of social norms. For example, things like capitalism that determines what a comparative is. That there is no comparative norm that exists in this society. You cannot work ever to be enough. There is no sufficiency threshold that is going to exist. It is also that this norm is relational. That even if you work harder, other people are still going to be driven to work hard as well. This means that you are not going to gain a relative comparative advantage just from working hard alone. Certainly, it is going to be hard for you to ever opt out. The reason behind it is that ever since you're 18, you're being fed into a system that tells you that human beings boil down to capital. It tells, no matter what college you go to, it also tells you that oftentimes the locus of control for this norm is independent from you. You do not determine your self-worth. It is things like KPI, it is things like corporations that determines what you do is valuable. It is not internal drive that exists from this norm. I want to talk about two arguments. Firstly, why this makes you a fucking machine of labor and why that's bad upon the individual level. Second, I want to talk about societal harm as a whole. Because I think the comparative world that exists upon opening government is a world that exists now, in which people work for 12 hours a day, in which the average Dyson worker works for 14 hours a day, stuck in the contemporary. There's people who go to Goldman Sachs who works around 80 billable hours a week. This is horrible because this is beyond the basic human body is able to detach. I think there's huge individualistic harm. Here are some of the harm. Firstly, is that it distrusts your actual values that you value in life and changes how social norms behave. For example, what was used to be conceived as a good father is the ability for you to interact with your kid and the ability for you to care for their kid. Now what changes is that the good father under this norm is being seen as a provider, is the one who's able to earn the most dough directly from it. This directly deprives individuals' ability in order to get other sources of happiness that they internally deem to be more important. I think it's a fundamental assault upon the preferences that individuals may hold in their society. Second, it is incredibly unhappy and is incredibly dissatisfied in the worker force. Naomi said, well, you find value in your work, but workers find their work to be incredibly repetitive. A vast majority of people work in repetitive labor, they do not derive utility from it, even in the first few months or the first few years of your life. But all the while, after 20 years, after you see that your life is a repetitive cycle, that's why individuals turn to alcohol, right? That's why alcohol is so popular. That's why mental health risk is at an all-time high, rather than just individuals being able to be completely brainwashed by the system. Individuals still have some level of self-consciousness in which they feel like their work is repetitive, they cannot derive totality value. Second, oftentimes, even if you don't believe that, productivity is also going to be endogenous from your control. This is something that Naomi does not touch upon, which a lot of times is not you who is able to decide your own productivity. It's things like class ableism, things like education that determines the material condition of your life that makes you be able to change your materialistic condition about productivity. As a result of this, a vast majority of people in our society are not deemed as their work has labor, that the labor has unique value to it. They're being seen as replaceable by robot. I think this is a significant harm to individuals because every day you internalize the narrative that your life has no inherent meaning rather than the billable hours upon your sheet. I think this is a horrible norm for society to take. This also means that you're more going to be mentally drained and exhausted, in which burnout is likely to happen. You don't find happiness in other elements of your life because your life is going to be incredibly intrusive by the existence of those norms. That when you go back to home, you're still disrupted by emails. That you do not spend enough time with your family. Oftentimes, you only spend a few dinners with the people they necessarily love. As a result, how should you weigh this? You should weigh this as an aggregation of all the societal personal unhappiness. When that is an aggregate, that means the society is entirely unhappy. Every debate impasse circulates back into human unhappiness. If we're theoretically able to achieve that, that's something you should weigh significantly. What is a comparative? Comparative is that you switch to other form of narratives, things like religion, things like community, things like family, that you're able to derive multiple utility from different sources of narrative. This is more reflective of what you want as an individual. It also means that you're able to derive more happiness from it if you're given the ability to choose before that CG any point. OG.
So how are any things like science or religion mutually exclusive? If people want to access enjoyment from that, they still could.
Sure, because oftentimes it takes up 16 hours of your time, only 24 hours, and people outside of debaters need to sleep. It also means that when you're incredibly exhausted by the capitalistic system, you do not enjoy other values. It also means internally, you see them as less valuable, you deem them as less valuable because of society telling you that your ability and your product of labor from the labor itself. Second, I want to talk about societal level harm because you're unconsciousness of any oppressions that exist. That is because of the gamification of labor and normification of labor that tells you that when you actively compete against other individuals, you're being opted into this norm. You're being coerced into this, in which you think that this is the norm. What it resolves is that you're unaware that you're getting actively scammed by the capitalistic system, in which the only thing you pay is then for the goods of the capitalistic system in order for you to drain up for you in the future. That it's also protecting you from going to protests and shocks because you're incredibly drained by the entire system. It also means that because you derive your self-value upon work, you're incredibly scared of losing that work in the first place. It means you're unlikely to participate in working union, unlikely to participate in social movements that manage to oppose those very notion of oppression that opening government deemed to be harmful upon a societal aggregation level. This means that participation in labor union is at an all-time low. It means that individuals will formulate a moral consciousness. Second, you judge other individuals upon the same level of value, right? In which if you see that other individuals not productively actually contribute to society. That's why we don't justify social welfare. That's why we oftentimes only justify social welfare. That's why like a lot of house insurance in America and a lot of capitalist nations are dependent upon and are attached into workplace. I mean, that people don't support for things like universal healthcare. That's dependent upon your ability as an individual rather than your ability as an independent work unit. I think that is horrible because people oftentimes cannot be as productive due to endogenous social reasons as listed. I also think it's not a human society we want to live in. Lastly, upon societal aggregate, it also means that there's more health and mental risk, like liver cancer is at an all-time high due to people not sleeping in regular schedule. It also means things like depression oftentimes outweigh. This is significantly more important than a few kids getting additional ADHD drugs, when it means that we create a societal norm that people are unhappy, are drained by the capitalist system, that they derive their self-worth from something that is arbitrary, that they cannot find happiness from repetitive work. I think that is a norm that is horrible. Very happy to oppose.
We thank the leader of opposition for that speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. I use here, they, and POIs in the chat, please. Opening opposition needed to be a lot more comparative with self-worth, because it is correct that there are a lot of Goldman Sachs workers who work 60 hours a week. But the much more common characterization is the average lower middle class individual who works 60 hours a week between McDonald's, Uber, and the ride sharing business that they also work at. This is the person that is the vast majority of cases. We're not talking about investment bankers who might be slightly sad but can go home to their bed of money. We're talking about people who will have to work the long hours regardless and who need to do that to make ends meet for their family. Those people are going to be still working. They're still not going to see their children. They're still going to be stressed as shit. We're just saying this is a much, much better way of allowing that person to find sanctity within that life. There were two impacts that made this better. Firstly, that labor was no longer demonized, as Naomi pointed out, that the value of being productive, even no matter what position you were in that productive chain, was valuable in and of itself. We were much more likely to do things like give workers time off, for example, when we cared about them as people rather than just as numbers, like literally accounting sheets that we're paying them. Instead, when they are productive individuals who we ought to care about, we were much more likely to give them benefits. This was not responded to by opening opposition. They need to weigh against that. Secondly, it was that you made yourself feel better, not based on how much money you make, which was something often deeply immutable. The fact that you were being paid the $11 minimum wage or whatever, and you tied that to your self-worth on opposition side when you had to come home and tell your family member that they couldn't eat anymore. On our side, it was much better because you could at least find fulfillment in the fact that you were doing something that you found productive, that you were spending your days doing something that was helping other people, for example. That productivity was much more likely to be able to be fulfilling for people who would not be able to change their material conditions on either side of the house. That gained fulfillment and satisfaction for the vast majority of individuals. Weighing this in the round, I just don't give a shit about the Goldman Sachs employee. Like, I'm sure it is really, really tough for them. But as I said, they go home to a bed of money. In the vast majority of cases, there is very little change for that person. Weigh that as much, much less than the vast, vast majority of people who are massively hurt on their side of the house because of this first theme. Self-worth for those people is better. We heard literally no response on this from opposition. I'll take CO first.
It seems reasonable to levy this accusation against opening opposition until you think about the fact that Naomi said at the end that you want charity workers and doctors to work longer hours, which seems like you accept that people buy into this norm and are expected to work harder.
Correct. It is two characterizations. For those who are already working very hard, this makes their life material better. For those who are already doing well and can work more hours, we think that is a good thing and we care less about them and they weigh more. Like, that was the whole point of the first thing. So then, on mental health, there are several things to say here. First of all, externally, alternative narratives always existed. They may not have always existed at the advent of this narrative, but they have often emerged alongside as people got sadder as a result of being more productive. And then conversely, they realized, oh, maybe we should be less sad and maybe we should invest in things like therapy. But secondly, and more importantly, just internally, companies have started to realize that it is a really good idea to not have workers who are sad as shit all the time. And the reason for that is because they are less productive. This narrative has actually increased the investment of companies like Goldman Sachs into investing into mental health services for their employees. And the very reason for that is because they wanted to get those employees more productive in the first instance, and people who have terrible mental health are much less likely to be productive. What this suggests to us is that this narrative has actually buttressed the claim of many, many other workers to access mental health services, to access things like break every once in a while, such that they do not not have to work long hours. But look to the counterfactual world. We're just making raw amounts of money. We're just putting someone through terrible, terrible things for the end outcome rather than the means of being productive within that service. That was much more likely actually to spur on terrible mental health outcomes when no one was likely to care about that. But the final thing to say here was the accessibility of the narrative that Naomi points out, because it is true that it is probably tough in many instances, and it is probably bad in some instances for your mental health to be constantly pushed to be productive. But it is worse when you literally cannot control the other narratives, when someone else determines what your wage is and you tie your worth to that. Or literally you cannot change how many lives you save, for example, as a charity worker, because you're just one in a sea of millions. Or as a researcher, you can't change whether or not your research gets something passed. Or as a family member even, it's very difficult to see the returns of you being nice to your family member. Those are often all deeply immutable, whereas our narrative was much more likely to be subjective, and productivity was something that you could define for yourself. That was because it was subjective. As they point out, productivity can be measured against other people, but it can also often be deeply individualized. What I mean by this is it's easier when it is not a cut and dry, when it is not a number on a sheet, it is instead what you feel to be productive yourself. It is much easier for things like your friends, your therapists, your families, all of that, those sort of people who you know, to talk you out of certain characteristics, like to say that, no, you genuinely are being productive, even if it's just like matter filing for a debate tournament that you probably aren't going to win anyway. These are all things that we can convince ourselves are productive in our side of the house, compared to the comparison point of much more objective standards there. Greg, go for it again. Or CO, doesn't matter which one.
Yeah, you say capitalist norms will continue to exist on OO's side, for instance, the desire to get money or achieve outcomes if not be productive. Apparently they don't exist when you start talking about mental health, because it seems like the desire to make your workers achieve outcomes will still induce them to invest, even if not to increase their productivity. You can't have it both ways.
I was saying marginally less because you cared more about the function of the work, the productivity on this side. Like, it was nuanced. Just you should have listened to that part of my speech, I guess. So CO then says, but some people are viewed to be more productive than others, i.e. artists are not viewed to be productive. I would just contest this characterization. I'd say the vast majority of people do view people who contribute in other ways to society to be productive in many ways. This is a very, like, I don't know, Greg, don't you study philosophy? Like, geez. But the second thing is just that regardless, you can find internal validation in other ways that are not external. Like, not all of us are socially conditioned by everyone around us, by broader society, that everything we're doing is bad. Instead, we can do things like contact our friends or family members, etc. The last thing to say is on opening opposition's claim on classism and elitism. Even if people try to tell you what productivity looks like, this is also something you can still try to establish yourself. This is also something that emerged alongside other notions of individualism and self-care, for example. Note that the notion of a say, like self-care industry emerged as this productivity narrative started to be created. What was the marginal change at the end then? It was for people who were much, much happier in their everyday work and still had to do that work. But for those who did not have to do that work, for someone who, say, could forego potentially doing that last trade of their day of day trading, or for that person who did not have to spend long hours researching that vaccine cure because they already had tenure at their local professorship, for example, that was the marginal change of who was more likely to work more. Because when you valued the process of working itself, rather than just the end outcome, those things that don't necessarily have directly perceivable outcomes that you can contribute directly, those are much more likely to be valued. So it was things like research for medical care that was going to be deeply impactful for thousands of people, but you couldn't perceive the impacts directly as someone working on it when your marginal change was quite slim. We're very proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Panels, debate is a holistic activity in that I cannot tell you the absolute marginal change in a social norm being deleted from society. But what I can tell you is that this social norm is not just the marginal improvements in everyday's life in which we extract a little bit more from each other and a little bit more from our work. It is a social norm that is enforced on many individuals that makes them feel worthless. And yes, capitalism does that too, but this one plays a unique role. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about in this speech is how does it interact with other narratives? Because Naomi's claim here, and then echoed at DPM, is that this narrative is additive, that you could add this to self-care and you can add this to other things that balance it out and lead to happiness. But this is a very powerful norm in that capitalism enables it through corporations, through advertisement, through self-identity internalization that is much more coercive than they say. Why do we know this to be true? The first reason is that when it stacks upon another norm, it takes it over. Look to feminism and its radicalism in the 1960s, in which it was one which told women to seek autonomy outside both parenthood and the workplace, and now is one in which they're supposed to lean into the workplace. This is what we meant by it killed the multiplicity by which we can find happiness. Their claim is, well, you can still go to church and you can still do those other things, but at a very low marginal extent. Firstly, because even in their own examples, they agree that the marginal loss of time when fed into productive systems and the cult of personality means you have very little leisure time, and the leisure time you do have feels really bad. But additionally, the search within that metric at each point means you lean upon dominant narratives, because even if you can't look for numbers, you'll try to. If you are religious, it means you are not religious on your own terms. You lean towards prosperity gospel. You lean towards things that have KPIs and measurements and ways of measuring yourself against others, which means it corrupts the other narratives, and that productivity is therefore mute. I'll take CG now.
How does your world cater for people who feel?
Can you repeat that?
How does your world cater for people who feel? People who feel.
I can't hear you at all.
How does your world cater for people who feel?
So, our alternative for people who feel, I'm going to deal with this part of the clash as to how do we judge a human life. This is where I think OG gets it the most wrong, in that they want to have productivity be just a norm in which workers marginally improve how much they output. But output for who? Because an Uber driver that makes one more ride makes around $5 after all the mileage they take out of their car and all that they do and all their costs. That optimization is so marginal in the grand scheme of things. And the unhappiness they used to extract that was key in our examples and analysis, because the marginal increase for an Amazon worker meant that they had to pee in a bottle. The marginal increase for an individual meant more back pain and more sacrifice, and at each point meant you lost a part of yourself to the workplace. They say, well, this just makes capitalism more worry, but I would say what makes capitalism actually sustainable and actually something that's worthwhile is when you can find a multiplicity. Capitalism at its best is not a value system, but a market organizational force. When it is internalized by an individual and the metric by which they extract happiness, that is when it becomes problematic. And productivity uniquely does that because it makes you internalize its norms and valuations and virtues. Because independent of this, capitalism would just be an organizing principle in which it told you money was important, but you could better fight against those norms when you did not internalize it, when you found pride in other areas of your life that were not overwhelmed by this narrative and these sets of norms. I'll take OG now.
So it's unclear why this narrative would take over others, given how many are there, like religion in the self-care industry. People have inclinations to opt into social norms that tend to be the most fulfilling, meaning that we access the largest tipping point for those who don't have identity in other spheres.
So this gets me up to my next clash, which is about the distortive nature of this norm. Because the things like self-care, right, are not things that are out of the ether and utile to individuals. They're things that ameliorate certain harms, but those harms only occur because we try to extract so much out of ourselves. And no, these are very short-termist and very pointless. Things like oh, I'll do self-care and eat a little junk food. Do not stop the fact that we are headed towards an apocalyptic state of affairs. Do not stop the fact that we suffer and take away from ourselves at each point in our valuation system and distorts us away from looking towards happiness. Because we told you, people are very different, and this is where the kinds of analytical philosophy square peg do not work from Naomi. That yes, we all assent to happiness, right? But there are multiple ways to get there, circumscribed upon our place in society and how we identify and build meaning out of our lives. We are not merely animals which just live to eat and fuck. We live in order to make meaning out of our decisions, and that cannot be done when we look to metrics like productivity, a set of norms circumscribed and spread by capital. And that is the reason why it is so overwhelming, because corporations have a vested interest to do this. They say, well, it goes against the profit incentive because they provide things like self-care, but that is so you don't fall apart and don't opt out of that narrative. We told you in a comparative world, in a world that was not that many years ago, we could find meaning elsewhere with much more efficaciousness because we were still connected to others and looked outwards for meaning, looked to meaning in relationships and the human existence beyond KPI numbers and internalized value. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To continue the debate, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the Member of Government. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm ready to start. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it's important to notice that the info slide clearly characterizes what cult of productivity is. The info slide says it is both professional and personal development, right? That determines the value of how virtuous of how virtuous you are. Notice that the discussion you get from both opening government and opening opposition is one that only characterizes the professional aspects of individuals' lives and neglects the aspect of individuals' personal life. And that is why opening opposition runs a contextual argumentation to say that, well, people will tie their self-value to work. And because of how work can be so harmful or detrimental to individuals' mental health, it means that this system is one we need to opt out from. The problem is that one, apart from that, the fact that this is counterintuitive to what the motion describes as productivity, because it includes personal development, which I'll subsequently explain. It secondly means that individuals, if they don't tie their self-worth to things like their professional lives and personal life and personal development, they are going to resort to other forms of other recreational forms of escapism, and that is exactly what our extension would be on why these counterfactual escapist measures will be very bad. What then does the personal development here in the motion looks like? So it means learning new hobbies. It means building deeper relationship with your family members, right? It means having a balanced life. That is to say, it's not an individual prioritizing only their personal, their professional life or only their personal life. It is an ability to balance between these two. We think that's what this particularly means. Notice that our narrative is one that is inclusive as opposed to the exclusionary model you get from open opposition, because individuals generally can opt into the system where one, they are building meaningful bonds with family and building meaningful bonds with themselves in terms of building up their desires, etc. And more importantly, they can internalize a resolution as to what work capacity means. And at the point where they reach their target, it means they fit into the narrative of productivity. Individuals are not swayed with the wind. Why is what then is our extension, and why is this important? Because it means that on their side, people can choose to be productive or not. What the harms with this particular narrative means that individuals, when are not active, right, or productive, instead of resorting to other meaningful things, would end up resorting to social vices. What does this particularly looks like? It means that individuals will now have to resort to system like the use of, say, drugs, use of use of drugs, alcohol, or etc. in instances where they are idle and free. Why is this particularly pernicious? Because one, it means that individuals do not have a good metric for which they can judge themselves, and they are in constant doubt as to whether they are living a life with purpose, right? Because individuals in the system we live in need continuous reassurance that what they are doing particularly is important. Notice, panel, that a world of processes and outcomes means that even if they feel halfway through the processes, right, in terms of work, etc., they can still find some level of solace because they know that these particular things, I think, like these particular actions towards productivity is one that is valuable. We think that particularly works. But notice again, panel, that individuals, even if in the best case scenario, do not engage in these alternative forms of vices, means that they are just going to be idle, right? What is the harm then in being idle? It means one, individuals neglect social interaction and the ability to integrate in society. It means individuals keep to themselves and now form withdrawal symptoms because of their inability to socialize with people, their inability to work beyond the confines of their office, etc. It means that outside office, they have no social life, right? But even when they don't have work, they have no social or meaningful life. Our world preaches a world of balance between these two instances without an individual resorting to these alternatives. I'll take a POI from closing.
Yeah, it seems like there are very good reasons not to do drugs anyway. The question is why this normal productivity is actually good at persuading people to live good lives. If it means that you feel stressed because every second isn't productive, it might make you more fearful of starting work and more likely to do what I do, which is kick back with a beer instead of doing work.
Speaker, notice that we don't think the delta of our narrative is to say individuals can't take short breaks. Individuals cannot take vacation in instances where they are stressed. It means that individuals do not make that a predominant aspect of their lives, right? It means that they are prioritizing things like their personal development, family development, educational development, etc., as opposed to work, living recklessly, right? We think that in that instances, that's valuable for them. Why should we make this, why should we channel individuals' ideas in a particular direction that is meaningful? Because firstly, we think individuals' productivity rate has the propensity to affect that of others. How does this particularly look like? Because we think that in instances where individuals are not productive, it puts a greater burden on the state to now cater for these particular individuals because they'll be engaging in reckless activities or not engaging in the economy. However, we'll be using resources, etc. We think at the point in time where there's a calculation of individuals' efforts, we are more likely to succeed in terms of outcomes, firstly. But secondly, it means that individuals can enjoy a good social life and good quality life that is not dependent on
Speaker, can you hear me?
providing for others.
Hi. I think you got a bit there. So if you can, I pause you around 6:20 or 6:15. So somewhere around 30 seconds ago from where you're speaking now. If you can start from that again. Can you hear me, speaker? Member of government? Government whip, are you here?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
I got
there.
Yes. Please,
Okay.
how much more time do I have?
All right, so I stop you around 6:20. So you have 40 more seconds. pick up from your speech somewhere around like 30 seconds ago.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'll be continuing in 3, 2, 1. So we realize that the absence of this particular dominant narrative particularly means that individuals have to resort to dependency. Individuals do not have a sense of fulfillment. Individuals do not have an ability to feel that they impact societies that they live in. We think at points in times where we create a good metric that is inclusive of all, individuals can find little means for which they can fit into society, one, by not being burdens to others because we can effectively evaluate how productive they are. But two, it means that these particular individuals can generate a sense of actualization, because this actualization looks like creating little targets that they can obtain. Panel, notice that the absence of this narrative is one that is pernicious because individuals are left to wonder. Give them a sense of fulfillment. We are proud to propose.
We thank the member of government for that speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the member of opposition. Here.
I'd like for people to POI me by turning on their videos and waving, or you can also unmute yourself and say POI because I never look at the chat. In a perfect theoretical world, CG is right that productivity applies equally to your personal life and your professional life, because in theory, these two are equally important. The problem, though, is that this debate doesn't happen in a vacuum. This debate happens in the status quo, which is very, very, very bad. 3 macro responses to CG before I engage on their issues and then move on to my extension about capitalism. So first, I think that some things are seen as more productive than others. For example, even though I both have a strong desire to go read a book or pet a cat and to also do my schoolwork, school is more productive than doing any of these affirmation things, irrespective of which one is actually more important to me. The reason for this is twofold. The first is because the cult of personality, as Gavbech agrees, is constructed in part by bourgeois forces who want us to work as hard as possible because that maximizes our labor. That means that they encourage us to conceive productivity with these aforementioned notions of actually creating more value for the company. But second of all, because productivity also dovetails with other ideals about what makes someone virtuous. For example, Protestant ideals about sacrifice, about foregoing short-term satisfaction in order to have long-term holiness, which means that necessarily productivity also glamorizes suffering and says the grind never stops, you must suffer, no pain, no gain, which is really, really bad because that necessarily means that personal life isn't often something that people focus on in terms of productivity, but rather makes you feel guilty because the opportunity cost is making more progress in professional life. The thing is that there are never enough hours in the day. I think that that feeling of guilt is just really, really bad. But second of all, on productivity, right? And here I want to clash explicitly with their claim, because what they tell us is that this is actually really important because the counterfactual is people are idle and don't do anything for society. A few responses. The first is, at the end of the day, to be honest, if someone wants to be idle and spend the rest of their life living off their parents' money, if that's possible, or working a dead-end job and spend the most of their time just sitting at home, reading books, watching television, we think that's perfectly fine because that's what makes them happy, and there's no point in making them suffer through work if that doesn't actually bring them any fulfillment. But second of all, even if taking the best case scenario, I think that they're far more likely to be unproductive. Why? One, because stress makes you less productive, aka if you're constantly measuring yourself against an ideal, that makes you actually less productive because you're thinking about how to fix yourself as opposed to actually doing things naturally. But finally, because I think that actually means that they're less able to invest in themselves in the long run, simply because at the point at which you're desperately trying to make sure you're never unemployed because there's so much stigma against that, that means that people are really reluctant to stay back at home, take a gap year in order to maximize productivity in the long term. People aren't perfectly rational. They don't calculate what makes them the most productive and the most effective in the long term. I think there's default to things that they're afraid to do. I'll take you later. So finally, I also just want to say that the way in which this works is often really, really poisonous, because the way in which people conceive productivity isn't personal, but oftentimes in relation to other people. And that's really bad, because the way in which you see others is always imperfect, because people who are other than you just present to you an outside-facing world. So what I might see is that Naomi just succeeding all the time. She's mostly just doing lots of debate tournaments, and she improves a lot. And I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. But Naomi herself might have lots of struggles that I personally don't see. But that means that I feel shame, I feel guilt, and I feel like I'm being unproductive. For those reasons, I think actually make people miserable. Finally, on drugs, I just want to say that drugs is a really complex issue. Honestly, it has more to do with the neighborhood in which you're brought up, whether or not your family is also addicts, whether or not you had a decent schooling system to do that in the first place. So second of all, I think most people acknowledge that drugs are bad for your health, and therefore there's a barrier, and people don't do it for the laws. People take drugs because they need to escape from something, aka the endless stress and monotony of a repetitive, endless job. I think we win over CG. I'll take OG.
So the problem is that as we frame capitalism as bifurcated in terms of the kind of productivity as an incentive to encourage, even if it values menial labor, which is better than nothing, capitalism also sells us vacations, planning calendars, and bath bombs, meaning that doesn't actually need to contradict the self-care industry.
The thing is, though, that the issue with that frame is that capitalism only is okay with being unproductive temporarily if in the long run it justifies productivity. That's really, really bad, because you can't treat yourself and be like, this is going to be fine tomorrow. You feel shame if you don't fulfill that task in the future. Then on my extension, basically that's just a cult of productivity, as everyone agrees, is a means by the capitalism to control workers. And I think that's really, really bad. And on our side, we got better protections and quality of life for workers. That helps us beat OO, because they just point to lots of problems, but their benefits of participating in social movements, for example, is all hung on actually decreasing the length of shifts in the first place. 3 lines of analysis as to how we achieve this. First, in the status quo, the cult of personality means that people have no incentive to change anything. Why? Because you glorify suffering. OG's own claim that you care about the process, not the result, means that even if your job is monotonous and repetitive, you don't feel the need to actually speak up against it. And I think that doesn't bring you happiness, because it's often repetitive, because you earn very little money, and therefore you're often hungry and cold, for example. And at the end of the day, the idea that you're being productive is poor comfort in the face of your physical sadness. But second of all, you also have no capacity to enact change, even if you have a strong incentive to do so. And the reason for this is because the cult of the productivity means that when you're not doing anything, when you're unemployed, for example, that's really the worst case scenario, where you feel like you're not contributing anything to society. And that's really, really bad. Like, for example, the cult is propagated by doing things such as shaming people who still live in their mom's basement. That's bad, because that means that people aren't able to strike, because they fear being laid off by their company. That's bad, because people are afraid to take a cheap job because they feel like that's unworthy and not productive enough. I think that contributes to the huge power asymmetry between corporations and workers, which means that workers can't press for change. Why, on the other hand, then is it likely that we actually get change in the counterfactual? A couple of responses. The first is because I think there's a current market failure, aka employees are currently poorly treated, but right now they can't leave. On our side, when they're more able to do so, that means that companies actually change their behavior in reaction to employee dissatisfaction. But second of all, because I think that there are currently counter movements which reject this idea of overwork, which means that in the absence of the narrative that you want to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that means that there's way more bipartisan support for legislating things such as more maternal and paternal leave, but also more sick days, more flexibility for workers. Finally, unemployed people, and this clashes directly with OG, right? Who say that this is good for minorities because they work hard and therefore we see that they're great. This argument only functions if it's true that minorities work more than everyone else. And that's probably not the way people see it, because again, they see their own experience first and foremost. But even if it was true that minorities do actually work more and that helps them, we actually think it's bad, right? Because that means that you only support and celebrate people who are employed, and you necessarily see people who are unemployed as lazier, as unproductive, and that being a fault of their own. I think we'd much rather protect these people, because they're also people who are unemployed, which means they have no capital to insulate themselves from discrimination. At the end of the day, the OG case, like, given that capitalism is eternal and changing, we may as well cope. We actually fix the problem. Thank you.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the government rep.
Hello. Am I audible?
Hello. Yeah, you are audible, but can you do like a mic check again?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so I would send in the motion to the test space and I'll begin as soon as that is done. Send, so I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. And now we think that it is important to note that society has always survived by the mere idea of certain standards for particular people to follow, right? And in today's debate, we think that the cult of productivity looks like one of those standards that society have set for us to engage in, right? But then other standards that society sets, like looks like society making things like honesty, chastity, and all other particular things like really necessarily virtuous within spaces in which they exist, right? I think that to the extent where there are a lot of people who, when the counterfactual exists, are more likely to do things that actually disrupt the sustainability of society. First of all, we think that we are justified to set these particular standards. So what I'm going to be engaging to today's debate is to show you how these standards like really are very much important and what we should consider in setting these standards. And that is what we should judge these debates on, right? That is what then that's our attention. So the first thing is how is what the counterfactual looks like. Then the first thing that society consider in setting some of these standards is what the counterfactual looks like. You get a particular counterfactual from our side when the member of government tells you about how people are necessarily able to result into escapism, and secondly, how they are going to be idle and necessarily like productive, like unproductive and not contribute anything to society. But why is this so? I think that intrinsic to human nature is the ability to constantly engage in an activity, any activity like one thing or the other, right? So to the extent where people become idle, it's not then unnecessarily they are forced to engage in particular things, right? The standard that we set in today's debate looks like glorifying a word and making a virtue of things like being busy and constantly engaging in one, personal issues, and then in two, in work issues, right? But then to the extent where societal stratification already makes provisions for times where you must engage with work and times where you must work with your family and be with your family and all of those things, that necessarily is important, right? But the second thing that you need to engage today's debate on is the thing that best brings balance to life, right? On balance to life, this is what it looks like. I think that the bunch of the engagements you get from open opposition, like inclusive opposition, neglects the particular aspect of the debate where we say that being productive or being virtue is premised on how you're able to be productive and engage both your professional and in your personal life. What they tell us is that, well, there are overriding principles in that regard, and the extent where these things are preached, the personal, the professional engagement is going to overrule other engagements like the personal, like the personal value in today's debate. Why you should not consider that in today's debate as this way, right? But no, we think that stratification already exists in the system. So people work and then people close, people have time to do other particular things. The reason why we are going to preach a narrative or we are going to glorify the world where people value both their professional and their personal life is the problem that exists in status quo. It's like people necessarily value the more time that they spend at their workplaces and offices to the detriment of other things because there is that imbalance here, right? But we're able to cause a balance where we equally make out of we equally make a virtue engagement with the personal relationship that you have with your family, engagement in finding hobbies and all of those things. Because in status quo, there are things like holidays, there are things like holidays and break that and vacation that people take in this particular instance. What happens and why that's problematic in their world that people necessarily do not value those things, and that's why they are arguing those particular arguments. To the extent where we make a value, make a virtue of engaging with personal things and finding hobbies like a member of government tells you, we think that you're able to cause a balance in society, and you get that exclusively from our side of the house, right? But secondly, on evaluation of life, at the end of the day, when you sit down to think about how worthy your life has been and how you've contributed to society, what should you be looking at, right? Should you be looking at the mere fact that you are happy sitting in your room, or should you be looking at the mere fact that you are in a basement or actually escaping to other things of society? We think that is necessarily something that people do not feel happy about themselves, right? Because like they said, there is a system where everybody keeps on working to the extent where and these people contribute to society, that people exist to be able to make meaningful life out of the societies that they live. It looks like actually participating in them. To the extent where these things are made a virtue, that people are able to reflect on their life when they look at when they look at how productive, how they've been able to make their children, their wives, and then their family very happy, but then how they've been able to equally be part of a firm and how the produce is there for everybody to see. That is what makes people intrinsically happy, right? But then the third thing that they bring to you is how capitalism, that's particularly from CEO, is how capitalism looks exploitative, and capitalism like thrives on these particular narratives to be able to survive in this regard. An engagement to that, what CEO brings about, we think that it's already established in the open opposition. An engagement to this idea is how necessarily society needs to be self-sustaining, right, in that particular regard, to the extent where the counterfactual of itself is an alternative that decides to collapse society because people don't engage in anything. Then society is perfect when there's minimal engagement, right? In our world, what it looks like by setting this particular standard looks like people are going to be engaged in that particular system. The reason why these people are not going to be slaves is that because when we say that working, being busy and being productive is actually a virtue, that people find work. People find happiness and work in the mere fact that they're able to go to the factory, the mere fact that they are going to work. Now, the idea of exploitation is better catered in our world where you make people like find happiness in it. Happiness in and of itself is a social construct that can be engineered in our world. To the extent where people are stressed when they find these things because there are no alternative that they can resort to, that it is very important that we make virtue of this. The importance of this argument and why we win on that particular clash of exploitation looks like this. That exploitation equally is bad, right? But to the extent where we are able to make people find worth and self-worth in that particular thing, in the instance where these capitalists fail them and are not able to give them the best of responses or the best of incentive packages to work, that's my idea that these people have been able to engage and contribute to society in that particular regard is something that these people are going to be happy with. On how you make the individual life or individual like a personal person as another class that was established in today's debate, you get this particular thing better in our world because one, regardless of the very little thing that you are doing, which includes being busy, which includes like working in a factory in that particular regard, we think that we make you happy, even in the instance where capitalism does not give you the utility that you get in today's debate. Panel, at the end of today's debate, we should be able to look at like the team that maximizes like personal happiness, but secondly, how that in and of itself trickle to a world where society is able to self-sustain, and you get that exclusively in our world, right? But we recognize how the opening like half debate was all about like the personal by within that's in and of itself a problem. But in a world where we expand the ability to be productive to ensure that people engage in productive things like personal relationship and build hobbies and all of those things. That's when we maximize personal happiness, and everybody at the end of the day, regardless of it, is going to be happy. Panel, we think that excesses might be happen where people push themselves off their limit, but to the extent where there is a balance, in able to be being virtuous by participating in both your personal life and your professional life, we believe that we're able to maximize that particular utility. At the end of the day, the team that makes everybody happy, regardless of the little things that they're able to do in society, it looks like just having a wife, it looks like just having a child, it looks like just working. It's something that we prioritize. What you are not supposed to prioritize is based are the excesses that may exist, because even in those excesses, those are just extreme instances. But to the extent where we balance these things out by giving them people productivity and finding hobbies and all of those things, they're able to balance the excesses whereby they're able to release their stress. Proud to win from season.
We thank the member of opposition. We thank the government whip for that speech. To end the debate, we'd like to call the opposition whip.
All righty. POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The most important issue in this debate, by far, is the ability to regulate people's working conditions. Because OO and OG are basically saying, in the times when you're not enslaved to this extremely repetitive job for 80 hours a week, maybe you can say hi to your kids without checking your BlackBerry. These are very, very marginal considerations compared to the ability to make that 80 hours of work better or worse for people. So you should prioritize X case mechanisms about actually regulating this rather than OG, who basically concede there will be no change to this, and OO, who make aspirational claims that don't engage with OG's claims that capitalists have an incentive to persist otherwise. So firstly, let's talk about working conditions. OG makes a claim, which is that people are likely to value low-skilled laborers, and therefore their working conditions or benefits or lives are likely to be better. The first thing is, I think this is probably exclusionary and bad. That is, if you believe that we're likely to substitute a norm about maybe not hugely caring people in general for a norm that productivity is good, this This will exclude unemployed people, and that is particularly bad for them, or people that do low quality labor that we think will exist. These people are usually the least well off in as much as they don't have sources of income and most reliant on the government. So we should prioritize mechanisms towards them. The second point here is I think that this is contingent on goodwill from the bourgeoisie, basically, because everyone wants better benefits anyway, but there's no mechanism about how this is sufficient to lead to governmental change, which is necessary. And so instead, we think you should prioritize XK's impacts by actually changing the market dynamics. Because OG's claims are basically capitalists want to be capitalists and there is an oversupply of labor. So if we can show that the structural conditions in the market change, we beat this because this is just a general reason that things don't change and not actual reasons why there's calcified. What do we tell you? We tell you crucially that when people are less likely to take the first job available to them or be incredibly terrified of being temporarily unemployed, this has a number of extremely useful benefits, other than the fact that we're more likely to get redistribution to unemployed people. Firstly, striking or losing a job is feasible. That means that people are significantly more likely to be able to negotiate for higher pays, because the reason why striking is prohibitively difficult is because unemployment benefit is next to zero in the interim where you don't find a job, and because you're told that you are a terrible human being during the time you're unemployed. We think this disempowers significantly labor unions, and we're much more able to actually hold them accountable, which fixes the problem OG identifies as to why you're unable to change things under their side of the house. Secondly, not all jobs are equally bad. Some people like them more than others. Some people are more cut out for working at Goldman. We think being able to wait longer when you're unemployed or out of college to invest in yourself, to upskill, is very, very useful, because we think this means that you're more able to find jobs that are maybe slightly better with respect to their working hours or how much enjoyment you get out of them. That is the most important thing. We change what is apparently the bulk of people's lives and is likely to determine crucially how they see themselves under both sides. We make these things better. That is clearly the easiest way to vote for closing opposition, but I think opening government disagrees, so go ahead.
So even if your best case is true that capitalism shapes entire notions of productivity, the 90% of menial workers not at debate tournaments obviously matter the most in this round. We compare ourselves to others because of capitalism and money, but when you have the self-care industry also saying things like productivity is self-defined, these people can't access benefits.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. This sounds oddly similar to the investment banking firms being like, we said that you could have Saturday off, therefore you have mental health. Isn't life good? I think if they lived in better jobs and they had Saturday and Sunday off better, we wouldn't need the fucking bath bombs. I think this claim about the incentive of the industry is ridiculous. So the final thing I'll note here is on CG that makes claims about productivity. I think the problem here is even if we value this and believe this is important to determine people's quality of life, XK makes a very crucial observation, which is stress doesn't necessarily make you work better. And in fact, our arguments about taking the first job are a reason why this is likely to be the case. That is, it often means that you're afraid of starting. You want escapism. You're more likely to turn to alternatives because you believe that the system is overwhelming you. With respect to the examples of drugs, in my limited experience with recreational drugs, it tends to be that people either use them because one, they enjoy them, in which case we're fine with that on closing opposition, or two, because their life is bad and they want escapism, in which case we think we solve back for those structural conditions. And this is crucially a reason why stress is likely to induce them to do it more under their side. So secondly, on happiness. OO says that there are other ways of acquiring happiness. So OG and then PM says, well, those things might be tied to things like money or outcomes, which seem equally hard to access. So I think OO needs a better mechanism why the alternative is things like religion. I think their second claim is more promising here, to say productivity is uniquely bad in as much as it takes over every single element of your life, even when nominally capitalism doesn't constrict you to work. I think the problem here is there are not clear mechanisms for solving this problem, because it seems like these things are endemic to a capitalist society that wants people to work as much as possible and constantly think about their living conditions and not just the normal productivity. So this needs to be accompanied with a claim about how things are solved, and XK is the person that makes that claim and not opening opposition. When XK tells you that we're more likely to get time, this clearly outweighs. By the way, this working all the time thing is what beats OG's claims about bath bombs. So secondly, on opening government and what they claim is uniquely good. They say it's inclusive. 4 responses. Firstly, it excludes unemployed people, so crucially not inclusive for the least well off. 2, it is bound up in other social norms because you're likely to be given examples of high and low productivity people. That means it's unlikely to be inclusive because there are literal examples and there are incentives for it to be selectively applied. Thirdly, it needs to motivate people further. It means it cannot apply to everyone. Otherwise, it has failed to motivate people because once you've employed labor, it no longer is something that makes you continue to feel like you're working. So it crucially applies all the time. OG, go ahead.
So your claim about like Goldman Sachs pushing people to work hard is number one, not exclusive if this is better for profitability. But number two, it gets better when you can talk about why things like burnout are bad for productivity, even if they're good for profitability, actually allowing people to access better mental health in these spheres.
But if they're good for productivity, they are good for profitability, which was the knife I pointed out in your speech, which is you say that people will care about outcomes anyway. So these things would likely exist. There's an incentive for this industry to propagate itself, but it's fairly minor. I don't think Goldman having an endogenous incentive to regulate is particularly significant, given they just want people to work as much as possible. We think it has to be on the workers' side, and we fix that pretty clearly, which is beating you. So it needs to motivate people further, therefore it's an incentive not to be inclusive. But finally, because it's hard to quantify, right? Like when I go to the gym, I'm not like, I don't know who went to the gym more frequently and who's genuinely productive. I just see the person repping the most out on the bench press, so like they're probably the most likely to go to the gym frequently. So this is always tied up in outcomes anyway, which means their claims about valuing money are likely to be what they defend under their side of the house. So crucially, if they want to say other norms are exclusive, OG's claims about making people feel happier are minor, but also probably symmetric to their side. The final thing I want to deal with, other than exclusive claims about stress, which obviously weigh against this pretty effectively given they apply like all the time when you're working, is they say it's up for grabs. Not the case, because people will have beliefs about what they should do under both sides. The question is, what do your family members tell you to do? These are clearly bound up in their expectations of what productive labor exists and are not things people do by themselves, and we give them X, Y is not inclusive. Very proud to oppose.